very, very mad and very tired of the way things were because it just wasn't working for them. So, yeah, they issued that and the Declaration of Rights of Man, which pretty much laid out what they wanted from this revolution, and they still were relatively ignored by the monarchy. So, then so fed up by the lack of supplies and poor treatment, some peasant women stormed the castle of Versailles, wanting to kill the queen. This represented pretty much a direct attack on the queen in her own house, giving the royals an idea of the rage of their people. And they took really some power away from the king, because they had to come back and move to Paris, where they're under the watchful eye of their people, and pretty much they knew things were not going to go well for them. They're not going to have the same power for a long period of time. Then they laid out the Constitution of 1791, which further detailed some of their rights and really, kind of took away some of the power and abolished some of the power from the king, which was incredibly bold and effective at that time. But the people who were leading this at the time, it's important to remember, the radical stage was led by the bourgeoisie. They were a lot more the moderate people. They were leading this phase because they were doing the most negotiation, soaking the revolutionary flames at the time. They just wanted to receive a stronger voice in the government, and they were really getting closer to achieving it, but there was still some fighting that needed to happen. And that leads us to the radical phase, which we will talk about. But first, just quickly here, the bourgeoisie, they're kind of the top part of the third estate. They're like the upper class of the third estate. They're the people who were best educated, the people who own property, and the people who were sent to the Estates General originally and kind of locked out. So they were the ones who were like, we gotta fix this thing, and they did it for themselves. And as I said before, they kind of ignored the ideas of the lower class. All right, so yeah, now we get to the radical phase, of course, and yeah, things are getting pretty intense. So the war begins with Austria, Prussia, and Britain, because the thing is, a lot of royal family members are trying to really escape to Austria and and France is worried about whether or not they are going to, and this, by the way, happens in April of 1792, they decided to do a preeminent attack against Austria because they think Austria is going to come and attack them because they have so many people of the royal family on their that are now in their country now. So like this raises a lot of questions, and of course, as you know, every royal family has some ties. It feels like in some shape or form. So that was pretty much how it went for them. That kind of led to a lot of intensity there and a lot of fighting that nobody really liked. And it was and I think it's a pretty important thing here to keep in mind is they were declaring war against the wishes and the strong objections of their one of their top leaders, Maximilien Robespierre, is a guy who you're going to need to know as one of the leaders of the revolution. And he was obviously the head of the Committee for Public Safety, but we'll get to that in a moment. And he was like, yeah, I don't think we got this one. They're pretty good at fighting, and also they have like a little bit of personal stake in this because it's ruled by like Maria Antoinette's like brother. So it's the Austria was at the time. So like all royal family members, as I said before, they kind of got a little bit of inbred connection in them, just the way it works. So that was something that was weighing on their mind as they went to war. And also keep in mind, as this is going on, there is some suspicion, and some pretty accurate suspicion, that Marie Antoinette is writing with her relatives in Austria, giving away some French secrets while adhering to the ideals of the revolution. And that's a pretty sketchy situation that a lot of people are increasingly becoming more aware of as time goes on. Then some really bad news hits the French army in Paris. Prussia, Austria's ally, has joined the invasion. They're going to fight with Austria and against France now. So you thought they were overall just fighting Austria. Fighting Austria and Prussia is going to be bad. And this makes people of Paris a little crazy. So the Austrian army and the Prussian army is under the command of the Duke of Brunswick. And he writes this big manifesto. He says, if any harm comes to King Louis, we will burn Paris down. And that's a big step to say, and it really kind of triggers the people of Paris. So what they did is, like, over 2,000 of them pretty much stormed the palace, the Tuileries Palace, where King Louis was staying, and pretty much attacked his guards. Louis had to flee to safety, but all his powers were stripped. The monarchy was at that time over in France, and that was a pretty big deal that represented the increasing radicalism of the revolution. Because one of the big things that the French have invented now is this thing called the guillotine, which, as I'm sure you know, pretty much what happens is you lie under a big saw that's attached to a rope. You put your head under there. People make you put your head under there, and the rope drops. So does the big saw, the big metal saw, and it falls on your head from a pretty high height, so you're dead. It's viewed as a very kind of clean, humanitarian way of execution. And shock, Robespierre, who again was against the death penalty, one of the people who came out originally against the death penalty, he kind of changed his tune and was like, okay, maybe this death penalty thing is a good idea, and the guillotine would be used many more times throughout the radical phase of the revolution, including on the former king of France. That's right. In January 1793, the revolutionaries, including Robespierre, who now is leading the charge at this point, execute Louis XVI by guillotine. They hold a trial for him, and they say, you know what, it's not that much of a point to have you around anymore. It just seems a little unnecessary. At this point in time, it just seems like, you know what, we don't really need to go there. And the French, like, you guys are working against a revolution, you're not being very cooperative, and we can't really form a new government when we still have the old monarch just kind of sitting around there. It doesn't make any sense. And so, yeah, they chopped off his head with the guillotine, as would, I guess, kind of makes sense, although it still is a little bit of a brutal way to end someone's life. Yeah, so that's kind of marked the end, and this is January 1793, as with Louis XVI executed, and the royal family was kind of secluded away in prison. Robespierre begins to lead the Committee of Public Safety, and the Reign of Terror in France begins. At this point in time, the Reign of Terror is underway. And it is it's really quite a interesting situation, because what happens is Robespierre battles for control of the National Assembly, as that changes his name to the Convention, and he eventually wins control and decides to, as he struggles with fighting some foreign wars back abroad, he decides back home to stamp out all enemies of the revolution in the beginning of the Terror, which pretty much means anyone who says any kind of negative word in any way about the revolution. And this includes people who are standing in line for bread and say, oh, I don't like this. Yeah, I'm feeling a little hungry. I don't like the way things are going. Like, even if you're caught praying, because praying and Christianity was viewed eventually by the revolutionaries at the top, Robespierre, as to be kind of a root of all evil. So if you're caught praying, that was a capital offense. If you're caught hoarding or monopolizing grain or any other resource, that was also a capital offense. Like, you just had to be enthusiastic, happy, smiling, and pretty much sharing all your wealth and not praying at all, in order to not have your head cut off. And even if you just told on someone and they didn't even do it, there's a very good chance you could be rounded up too and sent to the guillotine, just if your enemy snitched on you, even though you didn't do anything to the French government. So it was very much a terrifying time, as there even appeared to be some counter-revolutionaries fighting civil wars that Robespierre stamped down in an incredibly effective and brutal measure. There was even this guy named Danton, who was a big, boisterous fellow, kind of everything Robespierre was not. Robespierre was a little bit of a nerd, and Danton was originally in charge of leading up and building up the war effort for the French people, and he was like, yeah, this is a this is a real great thing. You should come join the army. We're fighting off the revolution. So he was very big, boisterous, and persuasive. He was very popular with the French people, and he decided to pretty much tell Robespierre at one point and say, this terror, this executing, this use of the guillotine all the time, I think it's gone too far. I think we are pushing things too much. And him and all his followers were promptly rounded up and executed. So that's kind of got an idea of where things, and that really did, by the way, raise a lot of eyebrows, and that kind of give you an idea of where things are in France, which is not a healthy climate for dissent at all whatsoever. So, yeah, and even at one point, Jean-Paul Marat, he was a newspaper editor who printed the most violent, deathly things. Like, his idea of the revolution was, if the revolution's not going well, just chop off more heads. He was killed by a counter-revolutionary at one point, and then she was killed. It just got to a point where it's just getting too much. It was just too much stuff going on, and it all came to a head when Robespierre got up in front of the National Assembly, or the convention, and said, I have a list of names, and these are people in the government, in high up positions, who are conspiring against the revolution. And the next morning, when he tried to read the list of names, he was found out. He was shouted down. He was ruled as an outlaw, and he was taken away to a prison where the next morning it was found him and some of his associates committed suicide. So that pretty much meant the end of the terror and the end of Robespierre. Next, we move to the Directory. The Directory, they took power after the fall of Robespierre and his regime, and this meant the reopening of the Catholic churches, and the defeat of Austria, as the French was the defeat of Austria, the reopening of the Catholic churches, and just continued also fighting as just things continued in other places, because Robespierre just gotten them into really so many wars. So let's now take a little brief kind of dive into the Directory, as this was kind of a brief but important step. The Directory was made up of the upper class, kind of the bourgeoisie, the moderates of the assembly, and it was still kind of the same function, but instead of all the radicals, which were called the Jacobins, it was the moderates, or the Girondists, who had the control over the assembly, and they were not very friendly to some of the people of the middle class. They were much more, or the sans-culottes, which were the peasants, or not peasants, but kind of like the middle class of the Third Estate of the time. They were much more towards the upper class, and that kind of rubbed people the wrong way, because at the times there turned to be a lot of government corruption, a lot of just mismanagement and bad governing at the time from these upper middle class people. And they governed for the upper middle class because they were the upper middle class, and a lot of the times the French people, they just at a time got sick of it. So they decided they needed a change. And a certain general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, was going to offer that change for him. He was very successful. He had come up with many military campaigns, including conquering a lot of northern Italy. So he was very, very popular with the French people. He returned home from Egypt, where he lost, but no one knew that at the time. And he managed to keep it out of the newspapers. And he pretty much stormed the Directory, and most people fled. And those who didn't said, we don't need the Directory anymore. It's okay, Napoleon, you can rule. So he and two of his friends established the three consul system that was present in Rome. And from there, Napoleon decided that he would want to be the only consul, and his friends kind of just fluttered off, and things didn't work out for them anymore. Then he became the emperor, and then he was pretty much he became the emperor for life. Is pretty much how it went there for him. Napoleon was actually a very interesting and effective governor at home. and I mean effective. He kept many of the changes that had come with the revolution by supporting laws that would both strengthen the central government and achieve some of the goals of the revolution. So he kind of went half and half. He was kind of a little bit of a halfway point between the revolution, where it was just radical, liberal, not liberal, but just